Donquixote Rosinante was born in Marijua, the land of the gods, as a celestial dragon. He was the second son of Donquixote Homing, as well as an unnamed mother. Homing was different from the rest of the Celestials though. He didn't believe their ideology that they were gods, above everyone else in the world. He said that they were humans like anyone else, and as a result, said that he wanted to take his family down to the normal world, to live among normal humans. The higher-ups granted him his wish, and sent him down to the North Blue, giving him a mansion and enough money so he would never have to work. He said that he and his family would live a quiet life there, but Doflamingo, Rosinante's brother, asked their father where the slaves were. All he and Rosinante knew were what they had been told since birth, that they were inherently superior to all other life and could do whatever they wanted to people, even take them as their slaves. But now that they were normal people, Homing said he'd have to re-educate his children, but unfortunately, the world would do that for him. The nearby town discovered that they were celestial dragons, and in revenge for the centuries that the celestial dragons had terrorized the world, they took all their anger out on Homing and his family. They had no choice but to escape, leaving their riches behind, and living a life on the run. They lived in abandoned houses, scavenged for scraps to eat from trash cans, and whenever they were caught, they were beaten mercilessly. Homing begged Marijua to at least take his sons and wife back, and he never imagined things would be like this, but they refused, saying he chose this life. After living in these harsh conditions for some time, Rosinante's mother got sick, and eventually died, but they had no time to grieve as they were still being chased. Doflamingo went away for some time, meeting some criminals who nurtured the evil within him, and when he returned, he pointed a gun at Homing's head. Rosinante begged him to stop, but Doflamingo said he'd use his father's head to return to Marijua. Homing accepted his fate and told his sons that he was sorry they had him as a father, and Doflamingo pulled the trigger, leaving Rosinante with tears in his eyes. Doflamingo left to go back to Marijua like he said, but was ultimately denied, and while he was gone, Rosinante was found by the Marine Sengoku. He took him in and raised him, and he joined the Marines, rising up the ranks until he eventually became a commander. After years of serving on the Marines, his brother Doflamingo also rose up, but in the opposite direction. He founded a pirate crew with the dangerous people he met when he was a child. They named the crew the Donquixote family, and it became one of the most dangerous crews in the world, not just because of their power, but because Doflamingo built himself up into being the most influential man in the black market, taking the code name Joker. Rosinante felt it was his responsibility to take down Doflamingo because of their family ties, so he took it upon himself to go undercover and infiltrate the Donquixote family. He met back up with Doflamingo, pretending to be mute because of trauma he suffered after Doflamingo left him, and this was aided by a devil fruit that Rosinante obtained that allowed him to block off any noise within a radius that he chose. Doflamingo felt bad for Rosinante and easily accepted him into his crew, believing in their family bond, and he gave him the name Corazon. Around this time, the crew was attempting the opposite of Corazon's mission by sending their own man, Virgo, to infiltrate the Marines, but Corazon didn't know he was entering the Marines specifically, only that he was on some kind of secret mission, so he couldn't warn Sengoku about it. Corazon did his best working undercover in Doflamingo's crew, minimizing the damage his brother was doing as much as he could. One of the evil things Doflamingo did was recruit impressionable children with nowhere else to go, and use them to make him more profit. To combat this, Corazon made everyone believe he hated children and would hit them as a result, but this was all to deter them from joining Doflamingo, and even though he hated doing this, a few hits to get them away from his brother was much better than a lifetime of suffering under Doflamingo. It worked with most of the children, except for two, named Buffalo and Baby 5, who no matter what refused to leave the crew. One day, he returned to their hideout and found another child, named Trafalgar Law. He again resorted to the same strategy, albeit more extreme, throwing him out of a window, but Law, like the other two children, refused to leave. That night, when they were all having dinner, Law explained his past. He said that he was from the town of Flevons, which contained a poison called white lead. It wasn't contagious, but it was a death sentence to anyone who had it, so he only had a few years left to live. He was the only survivor of Flevons, and in order to get away, he hid under a mountain of bodies. The ridiculous amount of trauma that he endured caused him to not believe in anything anymore. All he wanted now was to cause suffering to anyone he could to make them feel how he did, and he vowed to Corazon that he'd get his revenge on him for what he did earlier, and he didn't break his promise. When Corazon was sitting reading a newspaper, thinking about what Law said and everything he experienced, Law came up behind him and stabbed him right through the chest. This caught him by surprise, but since someone was watching, Law ran away, unable to finish the job. Corazon went back to the crew, but didn't tell Doflamingo what Law had done. It didn't even occur to him to do so, since his brother would instantly have Law killed, and he felt a great deal of pity for the boy, and knew all too well how a horrible childhood could affect someone, and didn't blame blame him for putting a knife through his chest. Doflamingo told Law he wanted him on his crew, precisely for the reasons that Corazon found so tragic, because of his horrible circumstances, and his loss of humanity because of them. Doflamingo then said that his crew dealt in devil fruits, and would find a cure for Law's illness, so that he could live on as their crewmate, for the purpose of one day becoming his right-hand man. This was Corazon's worst nightmare. He feared that one day, Doflamingo would find a child like him, going down the same path, and Law fit that description perfectly. He wasn't evil from birth like Doflamingo, but his past had chipped away at his humanity itself, making him cold, sadistic, and hateful, and Doflamingo intended to nurture those qualities. Corazon could only sit there in horror, and he knew he had to stop at nothing to make sure those plans wouldn't become a reality. There couldn't be another Doflamingo, no matter what. But he couldn't do anything to stop it for the time being, so Law joined the crew, and learned many things from all the members. 2 years passed, and he was having a conversation with the other children, with Corazon listening close by, which he presumably did a lot to keep a close eye on Law to make sure he wasn't falling down Doflamingo's dark path. During this conversation though, Law revealed his full name, Trafalgar D. Water Law, and said he wasn't meant to tell anyone this. Corazon was shocked and rushed towards Law, grabbing him and taking him to an alleyway. He put him down and asked if what he said was true. Law looked around, wondering who said that, since like the rest of the crew, he'd never heard Corazon talk. But Cor continued, saying if he really did have the name D, he needed to get away from Doflamingo immediately. Law started yelling that he'd been lying to them, which was attracting attention, so Cor activated a sound barrier. Law was pissed off that he'd been hiding all this from his partners, but Cor replied that they weren't his partners, and that he was there to stop Doflamingo's rampage. He recalled their childhood, how even back then, Doflamingo didn't have the ordinary response to the horrible things that they went through. His first instincts were revenge, hate, and murder, and those things carried on into his adult life, where he started taking things out on innocent people. He told Law that he couldn't become like that, and told him he had to leave, but Law refused, saying he wanted to become like Doflamingo. His trauma had left him broken, hell-bent on bringing chaos to the world. Cor said that he had the name D, and that back in Marijois, they were told to fear the people of the D. They were called the enemies of the gods. This was why Corazon wanted Law away from Doflamingo at that moment. Now that he knew of Law's heritage, there was no telling what kind of power or potential he had, and if Doflamingo did as he planned and made Law his puppet, that might lead to more destruction than ever would have been possible without him. Law didn't understand anything that Corazon said, just yelling back that he joined the crew to kill everyone and everything, and that he worked for Doflamingo, not him. He said that if he was gonna die in a year's time anyway, what point was there in leaving the crew? Cor said that he would look for a cure, but Law ran away, saying there was none, and said he'd tell Doflamingo about his lies. He tried to stop Law, but failed, and as he walked back to the cruise ship, he was sure Law did as he said, but to his shock, he didn't say anything, to repay Cor for not telling Doflamingo that he stabbed him 2 years ago. Cor didn't waste any time, and took the chance to kidnap Law and go look for a cure to his illness, only leaving a note for Doflamingo. Law hated this plan, and said the illness couldn't be cured, but Cor ignored him and called up Sengoku. He said he'd put his duty on pause for a while, but didn't tell him why. Law was angry, asking if he was in the Navy, saying he hated the government for the horrific things they did to his people in Flevons, so Cor lied and said he wasn't part of the Navy, then dragged Law to a hospital, confident they could cure him. But when he told the doctor and nurse about Law's disease, they were rattled. The government had put out propaganda to make the world think the white lead poisoning was contagious, to justify the mass genocide of everyone who had it, and the whole world believed this. The doctor and nurse were freaking out, and Law started shaking and crying, running away, saying the entire world didn't even see him as human. Only then did it dawn on Corazon, the full scope of Law's suffering. It didn't end back in Flevons. He was not only carrying his trauma from back then, but the entire world treated him as subhuman. They wished he was far away from them, dead, the second they found out who he was. The doctor started calling Law a creature and monster, as all the other staff ran from him. Corazon started bursting with rage. He punched the doctor and set the hospital on fire. He grabbed Law and started walking away, pissed off, cursing the hospital, and apologizing to Law for dredging up his past. Law said that he told him that would happen, but Cor held out hope, saying the next doctor would be different. But unfortunately, none of them were. Cor kept taking Law from doctor to doctor, and all of them reacted with disgust and hatred. Cor tried not to give up, but Law begged him to stop, until eventually, after 8 hospitals, Law said he was getting sicker by the day, and Cor said this was the last hospital. Either they would find a cure or he would die. And it went no differently from the others. After 6 months of this, Corazon finally accepted the truth. He sat by a cliff and started reflecting. He asked himself what he was doing. Law was born into tragedy, and instead of helping him, all he did was force him to relive the horror of his past over and over again. He asked himself if it was because Law was part of the D. but he said no, he didn't care about that. He was just feeling sympathy for a kid who's known nothing but pain. Back when he heard Law say he was going to die, he couldn't take it. He might have stabbed him back then, but it didn't hurt him at all, because Law was the one feeling all that pain. Corazon burst into tears, feeling like a failure for only worsening Law's condition, with nothing to show for it. But no, the truth was that those 6 months Law spent with Corazon were his happiest, and even though they couldn't find a cure, Cora was the first person to care about Law since he lost his family, and that meant everything to him. The next day, Cora got a call from Doflamingo, who said he had intel on the Opi fruit. He said he planned to steal it and have his most trusted man Corazon eat it, and he would be able to cure Law's disease. Corazon felt pure joy. He grabbed Law and told him to rejoice. He told him that if they could get a hold of the Opi fruit, they could cure his disease. He explained to Law that the fruit could alter the human body and perform miraculous operations, so he said that Law could eat the fruit and cure his disease, and once that happened, they had to leave Doflamingo's crew. He said that once his journey went longer than he expected, he figured Doflamingo had to have figured out that he was a traitor, so wanted him to eat the Opi fruit, then use his rare ability to grant him eternal life. But Cora said that they would beat Doflamingo and steal the fruit first, and once Law cured himself, they would find a place to hide and live out their lives. This was absolutely huge. Corazon was willing to sacrifice all his goals for Law. He was willing to cast aside his mission to take down Doflamingo, leave the Navy and all the people he met there behind, and live his life with Law. This wasn't the most selfless choice, because it meant abandoning his mission to take down Doflamingo, who was hell-bent on destroying the world. But Corazon isn't a perfect selfless character. In this case, he chose Law over the rest of the world, because through their time together, he came to view him as a son, and he would choose Law's life over the entire world in a heartbeat. So he called up Sengoku and betrayed him, getting information on where the fruit was and lying to him about his whereabouts, all in order to save Law. And so it was time for him to put his plans into action. But at that moment, Law passed out. His condition was at an all-time low. His death was near, and Cora started panicking, yelling that he couldn't die now, not when they just found a solution. He checked and Law had a fever, and started crying. He begged Law to tell him what he could do. He didn't know how to help him, so he pleaded with him to just stay alive, just for 3 more weeks. He took Law out into the ocean, into a storm, and Law woke up. He told Cora about the horrific things the government did to his people, and said that if he was one of them, to be honest with him. But Cora denied it. He couldn't bear to make Law suffer anymore by telling him that he, the only person alive that was close to him, was part of the group that caused him so much pain. They sailed onwards, and finally, arrived at the island. Cora found the group of pirates that had the Opi fruit, and he burst into their hideout. He cut the lights and kicked one of them, flawlessly stealing the fruit and running out, but they chased him, and he slipped down, being met by other members of the crew, and they shot him. He was able to beat them and escape. Getting back to Law, he smiled, showing him the fruit, assuring him that his life was saved. Law was still pessimistic though. How couldn't he be after everything? But Cora refused to hear it and forced him to eat the fruit. Law started arguing, but with his job complete, Cora collapsed to the floor. He said that Law could cure his illness. They beat Doflamingo, and they had won. But Law discovered that it was at a cost. He flipped Corazon over and found that he was filled with bullets. Law tried to use his new fruit to heal Cora, and this made him smile. He said the fruit didn't work like that, but he appreciated the gesture nonetheless. Law was panicking and asked what he should do, mirroring how desperate Cora was a few weeks before, and Cora responded by trying to calm him down, saying the bullets weren't enough to kill him, and gave him a mission. Cora may have been willing to leave the Navy for Law, but he still had a sense of duty from all those years of service. So before leaving, he wanted to hand over all the information he gathered about his brother, so the Marines could take him down. So he gave Law a capsule, holding everything he learned while undercover, and told him to give it to one of the Marines. Then they could leave the island together. Corazon was assured that the Marines on the island were good, and that he wasn't putting Law in danger by doing this. But of course, this wasn't a happy ending, so luck wasn't on his side, and Law went up to the only Marine in the entire Navy that could have ruined his plans, Virgo. Corazon realized who he was when he came back with Law, and in his shock he shouted his name, making Virgo realize that he could talk, and he started piecing together all of Corazon's other lies. He kicked Cora through a wall when he was already bleeding out from being shot. Law stepped in and tried to stop Virgo, but he threw him to the side, then destroyed all of Cora's research, years of his work. But that wasn't the worst of it, as he started beating Cora with no mercy. He was relentless, and he brought Cora to death's door, but kept him alive. He called Doflamingo to tell him of Cora's betrayal, and while he was distracted, Cora took Law and escaped. When Doflamingo realized, he used a technique called the bird cage, in which he could close off an area with no way for anyone inside to escape, and Corazon knew this. He acknowledged that there was no way for him to live through this, but maybe he could find a way for Law to get away. He looked at Law, who was unconscious, and he smiled, hoping that he'd remember him after he was dead, promising himself that he'd die with a smile on his face. Law woke up in a panic, and Cora managed to put on the goofiest smile he could manage, hoping that when Law remembered him, he'd remember that smile. Since Law's life had been nothing but trauma, Cora hoped that he could at least look back at this tragedy and remember that face instead of all of his suffering. He then put Law inside a treasure chest and told him that Doflamingo wouldn't find him as long as he stayed inside, and that pirates always take treasure chests back to their ships, so if he just stayed there, he'd be taken out of the birdcage and be able to escape. Law asked what about him, and he had no choice but to lie to him. He said Doflamingo wouldn't kill him since he was his brother, but he knew he had no such limits. Corazon then touched Law on the head and used his silence powers on him so that Law couldn't make any noise, then told him that they would meet back up later. He then made the same goofy smile again and told Law he loved him. Law started laughing and Corazon closed the chest, satisfied. He ran over to Doflamingo's crew to let them know where he was, then went back to the chest Law was in and lay down against it, and he was soon confronted by his brother. He looked him right in the eyes and he could finally talk to him honestly. He pulled out his pistol and pointed at him, then recited his navy position and his mission to infiltrate Doflamingo's crew. He then tapped his head against the chest so Law would listen closely, then said he was sorry for lying about not being in the navy, and said that he just didn't want him to hate him. Doflamingo thought that was aimed at him, so got annoyed and cut to the chase, asking where Law and the Opiopi fruit were, and Cora replied that he fed the fruit to Law and got him out of the birdcage, and that he was already under the protection of the navy. Coincidentally, the navy actually were sheltering a boy at the time, so Doflamingo believed his bluff. That was at least one small piece of luck in his favor after the avalanche of misfortune that he'd been facing. Doflamingo said they'd go after that ship and capture Law, and said the reason he was so desperate to find them was because now that he ate the fruit, he intended to raise Law to give his life for him. Doflamingo got angry that Cora made that goal so difficult for him and asked why he came back to stop him, and said that he was forced to kill one of his family members for the second time. They were pointing their guns at each other, but Doflamingo knew Cora couldn't shoot him, saying he took after their kind-hearted father. Cora stood up and said that Law would never follow Doflamingo. He already overcame his destiny, that he would die from his illness, and that he wasn't the same Law he was when he was on Doflamingo's crew, and he screamed out that now Law was free, but Doflamingo pulled the trigger. Corazon fell, and he remembered the few months he spent with Law, all the good times they had, and he was satisfied. He lay in the snow, bleeding out, as the chest Law was in was taken away, but he knew he couldn't die yet. If he did, Law would make noise and be found out by Doflamingo. He lay there, only focusing on living. Every single second counted. He told Law to walk quietly, so no one would notice him. Keep going and going. There was nothing to tie him down anymore, not the fences around Flevons that kept him trapped, or a shortened lifespan. No one could place limits on him anymore. He surpassed everyone's expectations and would continue to do so. He was finally free now, and Corazon smiled, imagining all the great things Law would go on to do. Happy, so happy, that if nothing else, he saved this one boy that the entire world turned their backs on, and he was proud of that, and died with a smile on his face. To me, Corazon's final moments might be the most relatable in all of One Piece. I think what all of us hope for is to be remembered fondly in the minds of our loved ones. We don't need worldwide fame or recognition, but living on in the minds of just a few close to us is enough, and that was just what Corazon did. He changed Law's life, saved his life, and Law kept him in his thoughts and memories every single day, which was all Cora wanted in those final moments, and if he could see how far Law came, he would no doubt give him another one of those smiles.